The painting was going to destroy Harlan Pressfield, and he didn't even know it yet. When Edmund Voss walked into Pressfield Fine Arts that Tuesday morning, he was carrying his daughter's backpack over one shoulder and a rolled canvas under his arm. His hands were rough in the way that hands get when a man has spent 20 years working with them. Scarred across the knuckles, permanently darkened at the creases no matter how hard he scrubbed. He was 43 years old. He had been awake since 5. He had packed Sophie's lunch, driven her to school, and then driven 40 minutes across the city to this gallery on Calloway Street, because a woman at the Historical Society had written him a single sentence in an email 3 weeks ago that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. That may be worth having someone look at. The gallery was the kind of place that made a man feel his shoes were wrong. The floors were pale limestone. The lighting came from somewhere invisible and made everything look like it was already behind glass. A young woman at the front desk looked up when Edmund came in and then looked at his hands and then looked somewhere past him. "I have an appointment," Edmund said, "with Harlan Pressfield. Mr. Pressfield is with a client. The appointment was for 9. "I understand that." She didn't say anything else. Edmund stood near the door for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he watched the clock above the desk and counted. He wasn't angry. He had learned a long time ago that being angry in rooms like this one cost him more than it cost anyone else. So he stood with his daughter's backpack on his shoulder and the canvas under his arm, and he waited. Harlan Pressfield came out from behind a curtained doorway at 9:11, walking alongside a woman in a gray coat who was laughing at something he'd said. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a pocket square unironically. He shook the woman's hand at the door and watched her leave, and then turned to look at Edmund the way a person looks at something left on a seat they were planning to use. "The restorer," he said. "Edmund Voss. We spoke on the phone. You said you had something interesting. I think I do." Harlan Pressfield gestured toward the back of the gallery without enthusiasm. Edmund followed him. The room behind the curtain was smaller, quieter, smelled of linseed oil, and something chemical Edmund recognized from his years working next to people who knew more than he did and didn't mind showing it. There was a work table along one wall, a magnifying lamp, a row of reference books that looked like they'd actually been read. Edmund noticed all of it. He noticed things. It was one of the few qualities he'd had for as long as he could remember, and it had served him well in the work even when it hadn't served him anywhere else. He set the canvas on the table. It was rolled with the painted side inward, protected by acid-free paper he'd bought at a supply shop, and cut himself. He unrolled it slowly. Harlan Pressfield watched with his hands in his pockets. The painting was not large. Roughly 18 by 24 inches, oil on canvas, heavily darkened by what appeared to be decades of varnish buildup and ambient smoke damage. The subject was barely legible, a figure, possibly standing, a suggestion of landscape or interior behind them, colors so muted by age they had nearly collapsed into one another. In the lower right corner there was a mark. Edmund had looked at it through a loupe for a long time before he brought the painting here. "Where did you get this?" Harlan Pressfield said. He said it flatly, the way someone speaks when they are working to keep their voice level. "Came with a house. I was helping a neighbor clear out. Elderly woman, moved to assisted living. She didn't want most of what was in the basement. I was the one who carried things out." Edmund paused. "I used to do conservation work. Before, I noticed the ground layer when the canvas shifted in the light. Conservation work." Harlan Pressfield said the words in a specific way, not quite repeating them, not quite questioning them. 11 years, mostly furniture and architectural elements. Some paintings toward the end. Harlan Pressfield picked up a loupe from the table and looked at the mark in the lower corner for a long moment. He set the loupe down. He looked at the surface of the painting for a while longer in a way that had no expression attached to it at all. "It's genre work," he said. "Darkened beyond useful examination. Could be anything. Could be nothing. The ground layer is unusual for the period the canvas suggests. And there's a second mark, partially covered, here. Edmund pointed without touching. I think something was painted over. Or the attribution was obscured. What do you want from me? A professional opinion. If there's something here, I don't have the equipment to determine it on my own anymore. Harlan Pressfield looked at him then, fully in a way he hadn't before. He looked at Edmund's hands. He looked at the backpack still sitting on the floor near the door. I'll take a look at it, he said. Leave it with me. I'll be in touch. I'd rather not leave it. Then I can't help you. The man's voice was pleasant about this. That was the thing Edmund noticed. The pleasantness was the whole point of it. Edmund looked at the painting. He thought about the basement of Eleanor Marsh's house, the way the light had shifted when he'd been carrying boxes up the stairs, and caught the edge of the canvas leaning against the wall. The way something had stopped him, the way he had gone back down. He thought about Sophie, who was 8 years old and who had been sleeping in the same bedroom her mother had died in, because Edmund hadn't been able to bring himself to change that yet, and who asked him sometimes, at dinner, if things were going to be okay. He told her they were going to be okay. He left the painting with Harlan Pressfield. 4 days passed. Edmund called twice, and was told each time that Mr. Pressfield was evaluating the piece and would be in touch. On the 5th day he drove to the gallery, and the woman at the front desk told him Mr. Pressfield was not available. On the 6th day, Edmund's phone rang at 7 in the morning. Mr. Voss. Harlan Pressfield's voice had a quality now that had not been there in the gallery. Contained, but differently. The way a bottle is contained. The painting is not what you appear to have imagined it to be. Genre work, as I said. I've had time to examine it thoroughly. I'd encourage you not to invest further time or resources. I'd like to come get it. Of course. Any time during gallery hours. Edmund drove there that afternoon. The painting was rolled and wrapped and waiting at the front desk. He didn't unwrap it until he got home, to his kitchen table, under the light he'd angled over the space where he worked in the evenings when Sophie was asleep. He unwrapped it, and he looked at it for a while, and then he picked up his phone and called a woman named Dr. Sylvia Morrow, who had been his supervisor at the conservation laboratory 16 years ago, and who he had not spoken to in nearly 4 years. She answered on the 3rd ring. I need to ask you something, Edmund said. Ask, she said. That was the thing about Sylvia. She didn't perform the question before answering it. If a varnish removal indicated multiple paint layers beneath, and the upper layers appeared deliberately applied over the original, rather than as part of the same work, what would that suggest to you? There was a brief silence. It would suggest the original work was intentionally obscured, she said, which happens for a few reasons. Most of them interesting. Edmund took a photograph of the mark in the lower corner and sent it to her by text. He waited. He looked at the painting while he waited. He had looked at it a great many times in the past week, and each time something in the quality of the surface told him something that he didn't have words for yet, but that he trusted. His phone buzzed. Where did you get this? Sylvia had written. And then, before he could respond, call me back right now. Edmund Voss had grown up in a house where books were read and money was not discussed because there wasn't enough of it to be worth discussing. His father had worked at a printing plant. His mother had cleaned houses. He had been good at making things and understanding how things were made, and when he was 19, he'd gotten a job running supplies at a university conservation department and spent the next decade teaching himself what the people around him were being taught in classrooms, because he couldn't afford the classrooms, but he could pay attention. He had met Rachel when he was 27. She had been doing her doctorate in art history, which was how they'd met, at a departmental storage facility where Edmund was cataloging materials, and Rachel was researching something else entirely. She had thought his handwriting was someone else's at first, because it was precise in a way that surprised her, coming from a man carrying a clipboard and wearing paint-stained work pants. They were married 2 years later. Rachel died when Sophie was 3. Ovarian cancer fast, the kind that outruns the timeline doctors give you by enough that the doctors seem almost personally offended by it. Edmund had been at the hospital for the last 19 days. He had held Rachel's hand. He had come home and made Sophie breakfast every morning and driven her to daycare and come back to the hospital. He didn't know how he had done that. He didn't know how he was still doing the subsequent years, which were quieter but heavier. He was still a good restoration technician. He knew he was because the work told him, because the objects he worked on told him, because quality in this particular field was not a matter of opinion. He ran his own small workshop out of the garage, furniture primarily, some decorative objects, occasional referrals from a local auction house for items that needed stabilizing before sale. It was enough. It was almost enough. He thought about Rachel when he looked at the painting, not because of the painting specifically, but because Rachel would have known immediately what to do with this. Who to call, how to move through the rooms that Edmund had never learned to move through comfortably. She had known those rooms. She had belonged to them without effort. He did not belong to them, but he knew what he was looking at. Sylvia Morrow had spent 30 years in conservation and authentication, first in academia, and then with an independent practice that had been called as expert witness in 2 federal cases and referenced in papers. Edmund had read in journals he'd checked out from the university library under a community borrower's card. She was one of the people who actually knew. She drove to his house 3 days after the phone call, which meant she had cleared her schedule to do it. That told him something. She came in and looked at the painting under his lamp for a long time, without speaking, and then asked for his loupe and looked at the mark in the corner and at the edges of the composition where the age cracking told its own story about sequence and time. "Edmund," she said, "I know. You need to understand what I'm about to say to you. Tell me this mark, if it is what I believe it is, corresponds to a catalog notation for a work that was reported missing in 1962, deaccessioned from a private German collection before the war, whereabouts unknown. There have been 2 documented attempts to locate it in the last 40 years, both unsuccessful." She paused. "If the layers beneath this surface obscuration are intact, you may be holding a work that has been off the historical record for over 60 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Edmund could hear the refrigerator. "What would it be worth?" he said. Sylvia looked at him over the painting. "Conservatively?" "At the right auction, with verified provenance and full authentication, somewhere between 6 and 12 million. Possibly more depending on condition beneath the overpaint." She set the loupe down. "Who else has seen this?" "One person, the owner of a gallery on Calloway Street. He told me it was nothing, genre work." Sylvia looked at the painting again. Her face was careful. "I see," she said. "When did he give it back to you?" 6 days after I left it with him." "And did you notice anything when you retrieved it?" Edmund had been thinking about this since the night he'd brought it home. He had not unwrapped it in the gallery. He had driven home and unwrapped it in the kitchen, and he had looked at it, and something had been different. Not in the painting itself. In the wrapping, the acid-free paper he had cut and folded himself had a particular fold pattern, a way he had creased it at the corners, and when he unwrapped it at home the creases were different. Close, but different. As if someone who was careful had rewrapped it but had not seen the original wrapping. "Yes," Edmund said. "I noticed something." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to move carefully," she said, "and we need to move now." What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic, in the way that stories sometimes make things dramatic. It was mostly paperwork and phone calls and a chain of carefully worded emails to 2 authentication specialists in New York and 1 in London. It was a consultation with a provenance researcher who charged $1,500 for an initial assessment, and who Edmund paid from the account he kept for Sophie's future, because he understood that this was the moment for it. It was also, at one specific point, a conversation with a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Patrick Huang, and Sylvia had referred him. He was young in a way that looked slightly incomplete, like a photograph still developing, but when Edmund sat across from him and watched him read through the documentation he had assembled, Patrick Huang's expression was that of someone doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. "You left the work voluntarily," Patrick said. "Yes." "And it was returned to you?" "Yes, with evidence of repackaging that I didn't perform, which you documented. I photographed my original wrapping before I left it. I photograph everything." Edmund said this without emphasis. It was simply something he did. "I also photographed the rewrapped package before I opened it at home. The fold patterns are not the same." Patrick Huang looked at him for a moment. "You photographed your packing job before leaving a painting you weren't sure was valuable." "I didn't know what it was worth," Edmund said, "but I knew it was mine." The legal framework, as Patrick explained it, was cleaner than Edmund had expected. The painting had been legally transferred to him by Eleanor Marsh, who had the right to do so, which Edmund had documented with a signed letter at the time, because again he documented things. He had left it temporarily with a gallery for evaluation. It had been returned to him. No transaction had occurred. Whatever Harlan Pressfield had done in the interim was a question for a different kind of conversation. That conversation happened at the gallery on a Thursday morning 6 days before the auction Sylvia had arranged through her contacts at a reputable house in New York. Edmund did not go alone. He brought Patrick Huang, and he brought a letter from the authentication team in New York, and he brought a copy of the provenance research that had traced the painting's history in a clear, documented line. Harlan Pressfield received them in the room behind the curtain. He looked at Edmund differently than he had the first time. Not warmly, but differently. "You're making assumptions," Harlan Pressfield said, after reading the letter. His voice had the pleasantness in it again, but thinner now. "About my intentions, about what occurred during my evaluation. I'm not making assumptions," Edmund said. "I'm noting that I left a work in your care. That evidence suggests the work was repackaged during that period, and that your evaluation characterized it as worthless 3 days after you received it, which I find professionally surprising, given what it actually is. Quantification is not an exact science." "No," Edmund said, "but it's also not nothing, and you know that." He paused. "I'm not here to cause you a problem. I'm here because I thought you should know that the work is going to auction next week. The catalog entry will be public, and provenance research is also public." Harlan Pressfield looked at the letter again. The room was very quiet. "I may have underestimated the piece," he said at last. Edmund stood up. "Yes," he said, "you may have." The auction was held on a Tuesday. Edmund had driven Sophie to school that morning and packed her usual lunch. The same turkey and sharp cheddar on whole wheat he had been making her since she'd decided 2 years ago that it was her favorite and she wanted it every day. She had gone to school. He had driven home and put on the jacket Rachel had given him for his 38th birthday and sat in his kitchen and watched the live feed on his laptop. The bidding opened at 900,000. Edmund had understood intellectually that this was possible. He had been told by people he trusted that it was likely. But there is a distance between understanding something intellectually and watching it happen on a screen in your own kitchen, in the house where you have been surviving rather than living for 5 years, in the jacket your wife gave you before she died. It closed at $9,400,000. Edmund sat at the kitchen table for a while after the screen went dark. He thought about Rachel. He thought about the basement of Eleanor Marsh's house, and the afternoon light shifting, and the thing that had made him go back down the stairs. He thought about Harlan Pressfield's face when it had finally held the truth it had been working so hard to avoid. He thought about Sophie, who didn't know yet, who was sitting in a second-grade classroom right now, learning something about fractions or state capitals, who would come home at 3:15 the way she always did, and drop her backpack by the door and say "Dad" in a voice that contained, somehow, the whole fact of their lives together. He thought about what he was going to tell her. He thought he would not tell her everything at once. He would make dinner the way he always did, and they would sit at this table the way they always did, and he would let the evening be ordinary for a little while longer, because ordinary had been their most valuable currency for 5 years, and he knew how to honor it. But he would tell her that things were going to be okay. And, for the first time in a long time, when he said it, it would be simply true. The gallery on Calloway Street closed 8 months later. The circumstances were not Edmund's doing, and he took no particular satisfaction in them, because satisfaction required more emotional energy than he had available, and he had learned to spend that carefully. Harlan Pressfield's reputation in the collector community contracted in the way that reputations contract in small fields where everybody knows the same people. Not with noise, but with silence, with unreturned calls, with names no longer appearing on invitation lists, with the gradual cooling of rooms that had once been warm. Edmund used a portion of the proceeds to set up a proper conservation studio, a separate building behind the house, climate-controlled, with the equipment he'd always worked around the absence of. He hired a part-time assistant, a recent graduate who had some of the same quality he recognized in himself at that age, the quality of paying more attention than was expected. He began taking on cases that he had previously had to decline, paintings, primarily. He also, because Sylvia had suggested it, and because he had thought about it carefully and decided she was right, funded a small research grant at the university's art history department in Rachel's name. It was for graduate students researching the provenance of displaced European works. It was not a large grant by the standards of such things, but it was specific, and it was real, and he had sat with the paperwork for 2 evenings before he signed it, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to feel the weight of it properly. Sophie turned 9 in April. She had a birthday party with 6 friends from school and a cake Edmund made from scratch that did not look the way the photograph in the recipe had suggested it would, but tasted, according to Sophie's unambiguous assessment, exactly right. She still asked him sometimes if things were going to be okay. He still told her they were. The difference now was the one he carried quietly, the way he carried most things. In the quality of attention he gave to what was in front of him, in the particular stillness that came over him when he looked at something and understood it. In the way he moved through the world as a man who had learned that value and legibility are not the same thing. That some things require a certain kind of seeing, and that the ones who do the seeing don't always look the way you'd expect.